Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive, and frankly kind of confusing, disconnect in modern geopolitics when it comes to the US and Iran. We're talking about the huge gap between official declarations of peace and the actual on-the-ground reality. Because look, when leaders tell us a conflict is over, we naturally want to believe them, right? Not just for global stability, but because this stuff literally impacts our economy and what we're paying at the gas pump every single day. But what happens when the military movements and the diplomatic back channels are telling us a completely different story? Let's break down the actual evidence and see what's really happening behind the headlines.
So, to set the stage for all this confusion, we have to look at some very bold rhetoric. President Trump publicly informed Congress that U.S. military hostilities with Iran had terminated. He literally went on record saying, "The war is very complete," and confidently claimed, "We already won the war." This obviously suggests Iran was significantly weakened and the whole thing was effectively over. But what's really surprising here is how definitively this was declared, despite the fact that there's absolutely no formal treaty. This set a very specific political narrative. The crisis is done, victory is achieved, let's pack it up and move on.
Okay, let's dive into this, because that sweeping claim of victory leaves us with a massive central mystery. If the war is truly won and hostilities are 100% terminated, why are the militaries of both nations still acting like they're right on the brink? As we start looking at the actual data, a glaring contradiction pops up between the political messaging coming out of Washington and the very real strategic maneuvers happening right now.
To get to the truth, we really have to look past the political podiums and check the cold, hard military data on the ground. And when we do that, we find clear, undeniable signs of an ongoing conflict. It directly challenges the administration's narrative of a finalized peace settlement. So let's explore the actual evidence that contradicts this claim of peace, starting with the deeply concerning military posture in the region.
This right here is where the claim of peace just hits a brick wall. The geopolitical reality is still totally fraught with active, ongoing military tensions. First off, take the Strait of Hormuz. It remains a massive geopolitical flashpoint. Iran's presence there isn't just some abstract military issue, it actively threatens the shipping routes that control global energy markets. A genuinely peaceful region doesn't have its most vital shipping lanes under constant threat, you know? Plus, US military assets are still incredibly active in the area. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Congress is still debating and funding what they explicitly call the ongoing Iran war. And behind closed doors, Pentagon officials are actively discussing potential future escalation plans. These simply aren't the actions of militaries that think a conflict is very complete.
And the evidence doesn't stop at military posturing either. It extends straight into a complete diplomatic stalemate. On one side, you've got the U.S. demanding full, comprehensive negotiations covering Iran's nuclear program, their ballistic missiles, and their military influence across the region. On the flip side, Iran just flat out refused to negotiate those terms. In fact, when Iran did finally put forward a proposal, President Trump publicly blasted it as totally unacceptable. So what does this tell us? It reveals that the core strategic disputes between these two nations remain completely unresolved. There is no finalized peace agreement anywhere in sight. It's just a tense diplomatic gridlock.
Adding another layer to this puzzle is a pretty surprising announcement from the Pentagon. They planned to withdraw roughly 5,000 U.S. troops from Germany over a 6 to 12-month period. Now, at first glance, this is a bit of a head-scratcher. What exactly does a military base in the heart of Europe have to do with a simmering conflict 2,500 miles away in the Middle East?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the hidden connection: global logistics. Germany isn't just some European outpost. It's literally the vital springboard into the Middle East. It hosts major NATO logistics hubs, it's home to the massive Ramstein Air Base, and it's the operational hub for the U.S.-European Command. Crucially, it provides the essential support infrastructure for deployments directly into the Middle East, and that includes any potential operations involving Iran. Critics of this move argue that pulling troops from this vital hub weakens NATO unity and significantly chips away at America's long-term strategic flexibility. Some analysts even suggested it might be retaliation for German criticism of the administration's overall Iran strategy.
So let's take a step back and look at the whole board. We've got active military threats in the Strait of Hormuz, completely failed negotiations on the core issues, and strategic withdrawals that have military analysts sweating. Which brings us to a really critical question. Why message that the war is won when you clearly lack a concrete deal? If all the evidence points to ongoing tension and unresolved conflict, why declare peace right now?
To answer that, we really have to look at domestic politics. A lot of critics argue this is essentially just political theater. By officially declaring hostilities terminated to Congress, the administration weakens congressional attempts to use the War Powers Act to limit the president's military authority. At the same time, it scores major points with voters who are honestly just tired of costly foreign wars and anxious about spiking gas prices. So ultimately, critics see it as a distraction. It masks a totally contradictory reality where the administration is threatening strikes, expanding military readiness, and rejecting peace terms, all while publicly telling the cameras the war is over.
But we have to look at the other side of the coin here. Supporters argue this isn't theater at all, that it's a calculated, genuine period of de-escalation. They point out that, objectively speaking, large-scale combat has actually decreased. The argument is that both the US and Iran ultimately want to avoid a catastrophic full-scale regional war. Plus, intense economic pressure is really hurting both sides, which naturally pushes them away from active conflict and theoretically toward the negotiating table eventually. From this perspective, pulling troops from Germany isn't losing strategic flexibility. It's a genuine reflection of shifting priorities to reduce overseas military footprints and actually achieve de-escalation.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly where the experts are split. We basically have three competing realities operating at the exact same time. First, the official line of "the war is over," which leans on the fact that major combat has slowed and both sides are dodging a massive escalation. Then you've got the skeptic's view of political theater, driven by the hard reality that there is no permanent deal. Military tensions are still super active, and the rhetoric just completely clashes with on-the-ground actions. And finally, you have the deeply pragmatic view of a frozen conflict. This is the idea that the fighting has paused temporarily, but the really dangerous root issues, like nuclear development and regional control, remain completely unresolved.
When we synthesize all of this data, from the dead-end negotiations to the ongoing naval threats in the Strait of Hormuz, a pretty strong consensus actually emerges among analysts and bipartisan congressional committees. And that consensus? It isn't peace, and it isn't war. It's a highly fragile ceasefire. It's a strategic pause hanging by the thread of political optics rather than actual durable diplomacy. Bipartisan hearings have expressed some serious concern that costs are still rising, military objectives remain super blurry, and at the end of the day, there just isn't a clear, permanent endgame in place. Which leaves us with a critical and honestly somewhat unsettling final thought. We've seen the evidence. The negotiations have failed, the military assets remain highly active, and the root causes of the conflict are still very much alive. So, if this crisis is truly just paused for political convenience and not actually solved, what happens when the political theater ends and the harsh reality of this frozen conflict finally thaws? It's essentially a geopolitical time bomb. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and always remember to look past the rhetoric to the reality on the ground. See you next time.